Welcome to the Craftsman Online Podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmanOnline.com, and you've joined us for an episode on A Deserving Brother. In his lecture, Brother Justin McCulloch challenges the nature of the special relationship that's shared between the United States and Great Britain. His conversation circles around Brother George Washington and how he's a prime example of American colonist assimilation into British culture. We're very proud to have him on this episode of the podcast. Welcome, Brother Justin.
Brother, it's great to be here. I'm very excited to share this with you.
Can you explain a little bit of the special relationship that Freemasonry here in D.C. has with Brother George Washington?
Colonial Lodge number 1821 is a academic lodge affiliated with they pay me to say the George Washington University in D.C., which is named for our very deserving brother, George Washington. The lodge was started in 2009, I believe, and is sort of erected to affiliate with the university itself. And the university has had a very special relationship with the lodge and Freemasonry in general. Many members of the lodge have been presidents of the university, and many presidents of the university have been Freemasons more generally.
There's a lot of unique history that the Colonial Lodge has with the George Washington University. And what I love about the lodge is a couple of things. If you're going to be visiting from out of town and you want to visit a Masonic lodge on the first Saturday of the month, Colonial Lodge is your place. You're going to love where they have their meetings, which I affectionately refer to as the Temple of Doom. It's just a joke. It's the Temple of...
It's the House of the Temple. So if you're a Scottish Rite Mason in the Southern jurisdiction, it should be a very familiar building to you. It's the headquarters for the Southern jurisdiction Scottish Rite.
Yeah, it's a fantastic place just to visit or tour or sit in a lodge meeting. And then I'll let you figure out when you come to visit the unique tradition they have with white neckties and the special robes, I guess?
Robes, yeah, robes.
Robes that they wear during their meetings. For this conversation, though, one of the things I loved, as you mentioned about, I always want to call it GW Lodge, but Colonial Lodge, it's an academic lodge, and you don't have to wait very long in Brother Justin's lecture to be hit with an instant Masonic connection. Also one that opens a little bit of controversy, where you open up with a bold statement that says Freemasonry is ostensibly a British invention. What points in your research helped you form that position?
There could be many arguments sort of on a metaphysical level where Freemasonry comes from. Some people might argue it comes from the Far East, it's existed since time immemorial. But when it comes to the United States, and Freemasonry as we understand it, I think today, is based off of the British system. And it makes sense if you look at the way Freemasonry has evolved. The first Grand Lodge is, of course, the United Grand Lodge of England, as we all recognize that as the first Grand Lodge. And then because of the British Empire, it sort of spreads to the four corners of the earth. And the United States is no exception. So when Freemasonry comes to the United States, and more specifically to the 13 colonies, it comes bearing, the Union Jack. It's a British invention. And it's sort of the way that colonists and soon-to-be Americans will understand Freemasonry is as a British innovation.
And that's the part that I enjoyed, because I'm with you, having still a member of lodges in upstate New York, where you can easily see where the seeds of Freemasonry began, I would say, in America, due to the movement of the English settlers or English forces as they were in what is now the United States. And it was interesting because I think the overall summary of your lecture was you really challenged something that goes against what we're taught in school, which is the whole reason for the Revolutionary War was that Americans were tired of tyranny. Specifically, they were tired of King George, which really, as you point out, may not have been the case, but it's just what's conveniently taught to us as kids. Can you explain what that difference is?
This is where historians will use very big and complicated words. So there are two main schools of thought on the American Republic and the formation of the American Republic. The first school of thought is called Americanization. It essentially posits that Americans were tired of King George, they were tired of tyranny, and they spawned a new breed in North America and felt that they were free and separate Americans, and they wanted nothing to do with Britain. That is what they call in history the orthodox opinion. The revisionist opinion, and I want to pause here and say revisionist is not always a bad thing. It's always the school of thought that goes against the grain of the orthodox opinion. The revisionist school of thought can sort of be summed up in a term called Anglicanization, which asserts that Americans didn't feel that they were not British. They were upset because they weren't being treated as equal British citizens. They viewed King George and the monarchy in general as the protector of the entire the colonial empire, the protector of the realm. And so when King George III fails to protect them from the acts passed by Parliament, that's when King George becomes the bad guy. Not because he's tyrannical in himself, it's that he's failing to stop the tyranny of Parliament. The colonists start out believing, we have no problem with the king. The king is our protector. We love the king. We want our own parliament that passes laws for us, not some parliament in London that passes policy for the entire empire. And so when that is not realized, that's when I think the colonists sort of rebel. So George is the much easier scapegoat, I think, because it's one person, it's one office. And in the popular memory of the founding fathers, there are these farmers with pitchforks that are rebelling against a very opulent, very bedecked king. Needless to say that most of the founding fathers are very wealthy men themselves. But it's a much cleaner picture than the sort of nuanced and complicated. The king is the bad guy, but he's a bad guy for this reason, not because he's just some tyrannical despot.
Yeah. And I think what makes this so difficult for us in modern times to connect, going back to like what we're taught in school, is we're taught about the first, settlers that came here, the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock, and the situation that they had with the early natives and the disease and the harsh winters and the survival. And then we skip right up to the Revolutionary War. And in between that time were a couple generations. And what we don't understand is it would be very similar to kind of, to put this in real layman's terms, like moving out of your parents' house, still expecting your parents to support you, you wanting to live under your own rules and laws, and them saying, no, wait, as long as I'm paying the bill, you have to live by my. I'm thinking this might sound very familiar to our listener now. And also in that mindset is the other radical concept that you may have had neighbors or friends in your village or town that wanted to stay as British citizens, that were like, hey, I know the crazy that we deal with from England, but you guys, this whole idea of a government of the people and democracy, this could fail and this could go really bad for me.
The American Revolution, to me, should be classified as the first Civil War, because that's what it is. There are, especially towards the beginning, like you mentioned, there's mostly, I wouldn't say it's a 50-50 split, but it's certainly not everyone gung-ho for revolution. There are people who are saying, we've got it pretty good with Britain. And there's a real concern about if the might of the British Empire, and especially the British military, leaves, what will we do about the Western frontier and Native Americans? Part of the taxes imposed on the Americans that become these intolerable taxes are taxes to pay for the French and Indian War, where Great Britain essentially came in and said, we're going to defend you from the French and the Native Americans, and we would like to be paid for it. We have used our imperial might and our imperial army and our imperial funds to defend the territory that, of course, is our imperial territory, but it's really your homes. The king is not going to lose any sleep if you die, but these are your homes, so we'd like to get some tax money back for it. Which, in putting it in those terms, sounds almost sort of reasonable. But it's a lot of people look at the situation and say, Britain is good for us. And that's why it's so hard for and it's so difficult for the road to independence that you get to what is called the intolerable acts, where we don't like it, we can stomach some of these procedures and these taxes, but once you cross that line, we have to go somewhere, because this is truly. I don't know if you know the song Rule Britannia. There's a line that goes, Britannia rules the waves. This is the era where Britannia rules the waves. Britain is the foremost naval power. It is probably, alongside France, the most powerful military in the world. And it's helpful if you're on a land far from the homeland and you're surrounded by people who really don't like you.
It's, as you said, it's good to have that protector.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the idea, the other crazy thing is too, is that we look at it as, having lived here, and this is great as we get on the generations now as, citizens of this, free country. But back then, the idea of imperialism and basically land grabbing, that was a really hot thing that was happening at that time. So the idea of having a distant monarch, that wasn't foreign at all.
No, it's this is the time in world history where powers in Europe, the French, the Spanish, the Russians to some extent, coming down from Alaska, they're all trying to grab North America, and there are these constant battles. The French and Indian War is a part of a global conflict called the 7 Years' War. It is just the American theater of that conflict, but there's fighting all over the world. And that kind of imperial land grab era doesn't really end until after World War II.
All right, let's get to, because I'm sure our listeners wondering, all right, I started this podcast. I said they're going to be talking about George Washington, Freemasonry, and England. What happened? So we'll kind of push the marker back to 1717. We know the Grand Lodge of England was formed, which was kind of like the big coming out party for Freemasonry, at least to the known world. We also had discussed, yes, you had English forces that were coming over here, English settlers that were coming over here. They were bringing over Freemasonry. Let's talk about Freemasonry in the sense of that it could be viewed as something as kind of a tradition or a practice in high society back in those times.
And I want to tie it a little bit to Washington. If you're looking at the upper crust of American colonial society, there are no lords and ladies in America. There are, royal governors who are lords, but they're British. They're not colonialists. They're sent over by the king to administer that territory for the most part. So the best way to ingratiate yourself and try to emulate the British system is to try to emulate their practices and the way they live. And so someone like Washington, who is a part of the Virginia plantocracy, as it's called, will try his very best to emulate British society and try to make himself a lord without title. And Freemasonry, I think, is one of the ways he does that.
I'm of the belief that George Washington, as we know as Freemasons, were told, first place we're prepared to be made a Mason is in our hearts. The next place is actually in a lodge. And it's interesting to trace his kind of Masonic journey and then the brief bookends of his Masonic career. There's a lot of time that's invested into the degrees and him becoming a Master Mason. And then there's this rather large gap of time where he was kind of busy doing other things, understandably. But then the end of coming out of that phase and back into his Masonic career, we see a lot more activity with now a more prominent brother Washington. What was kind of your, I guess, recap of that synopsis, that period?
A very interesting history for Washington, because Washington, even though he's like the preeminent American Mason, is, in terms of rank, titles, and frankly, lodge attendance for most of his life, is pretty average at best. He never really becomes a, high title bearer. And for a certain period, he attends, after he becomes a Master Mason, doesn't attend any lodge meetings. What I think is great about Washington is Freemasonry becomes so integral into how he commands his troops and acts as a commander in chief, and then how he really envisions the new nation. When he's a general, when he's fighting, he will stop and attend lodge meetings, or address brethren of a lodge and speak with them. And he outlines, using Masonic principles, his ideas, not only for the war, but he's thinking farther ahead, talking about what I believe the nation should be.
And this was just one of the things, looking back at the founding fathers, and a lot of them were brothers. And then this is where the excitement, I think, comes for a lot of American interested gentlemen who are looking to pursue Freemasonry, where not necessarily the national treasure story, but they want to know, like, oh, well, how involved was Benjamin Franklin in this? And how did the ideals of Freemasonry influence Washington or influence his activity, or Sam Adams, Paul, all these other famous Freemasons at that time? What did you see as far as moments that led Washington to be where he was in history, and if there were any Masonic connections that could be there?
I think his idea for the United States in general as a pluralistic society, the United States that comes out of the Revolutionary War is imperfect in a lot of ways. Obviously, the biggest one is slavery, but I'm just talking about religious tolerance, and I'll talk specifically about religious tolerance. Here's another big historical word. People have speculated, what was George Washington's religion? He is a baptized Anglican, but he probably wouldn't tell you he was an Anglican. Historians refer to Washington as a latitudinarian. Essentially, he cares less about specific religious dogma and more about the concrete belief in a higher being. Should sound familiar. He never refers to Jesus or any Christian principles, but he talks a lot about providence. This idea of providence is guiding me, and providence is informing our actions. And if you look on the back of the one, I'm starting to get a little Nicolas Cage, but if you look on the back of the $1 bill, which Washington is on, there are the words "Annuit coeptis." He favors our undertaking. It's not, it's not "In God we trust," which is added later. It's a very, very sort of open-ended kind of look at, this is a higher power, but we're not going to give it a name. It's right. Something that we believe is guiding us, but we're not exactly 100% sure dogmatically what it is.
Yeah. And that's what I like about this. And when you talk about this in your lecture, it really started ringing a lot of bells in my head, because what I love about Freemasonry is we talk about, the supreme architect of the universe, the great architect of the universe. We talk about a belief in deity. Yes, there's a lot of talk in our ritual, and we have prayers, we say God, but on the other part of that, we are open to all faiths and all different traditions and value systems, really, except for a couple, which we can have another conversation about that later. But most of it is centered around this idea of morality. And when you said providence, I started thinking, I was like, yeah, there were several times you had mentioned in your lecture him using that in letters or speeches. And he was always trying to leave breadcrumbs. What I found interesting was another connection you made, and we'll pivot to this part of the discussion, is that for him to not be the quote unquote most famous American Freemason of all time, that would pretty much be a pretty big sin or loss for Freemasonry, because he's the most famous American as we have right now. It makes complete sense that him being tied to Freemasonry in any way made him a rock star.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting that Washington is the one that is picked, because Benjamin Franklin has more Masonic accolades than Washington does. Benjamin Franklin was Grand Master of Pennsylvania and probably attended way more lodge meetings than Washington did. But Washington, at one point, there's a meeting, and because of Masonic politics between the ancients and the moderns who are arguing at the time, it doesn't happen, but they want to make him Grand Master of the United States. he doesn't want to do it. Washington is very much I don't like politics. I don't want that mantle. But everyone considers him essentially the American Freemason. He is the guy. And even brothers who are looking across the ocean, brothers in France in particular, when they send Masonic sort of diplomatic packages, they send them to Washington. They go directly to Washington. And Washington uses Masonry as a way to sort of solidify the French alliance and the French relationship, which we all know is very important to Americans actually winning the war.
I had shared with you a book after your lecture that I had read called The Return of George Washington. The full title is The Return of George Washington, Uniting the States, 1783 to 1789. And it's by Pulitzer Prize winning historian Edward J. Larson. And in this book, he talks about how Washington basically comes out of retirement. The book opens with Washington going in and surrendering the commander in the chief title and looking forward to going back to just being a gentleman farmer in Virginia, and pretty much getting called off the bench because the U.S. was a giant mess. After the Revolutionary War ended, we just had no idea how we were going to band together as now a nation instead of this little republic of colonies that were all fighting for basically the same value system. And it details him being involved with the Continental Congress and how he was pretty much selected to be the presiding officer of that. And the beauty of it is, for brothers listening, this book is not written by a Freemason. There are no Masonic mentions at all, but just this man's account of going through the letters and the papers at that time and putting this all together, you could understand how Freemasonry influenced Washington's leadership skills, at least from what we see in a lodge, where the master of the lodge really isn't supposed to be interjecting his beliefs or ideas for where the lodge should move forward. He serves at the pleasure of the brethren of the lodge. He provides direction. In Washington, that was on display. The other beautiful thing is that Washington, in his very own quiet way, was navigating certain compromises that needed to happen as there was this, tear between a stronger federal government, or just honestly the role of federal government, which we still see today. And it was neat because none of those conversations were ever recorded because he did them in private. And I was like, that is another Masonic of just whispering that wise counsel. So we get to see him before he became president in that book. What did you learn of him after he became president, and how he was able to use or scaffold some of those Masonic leadership skills as the first president of the United States?
Sure. So the United States is heavily, like you mentioned, heavily divided. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, large federal government, small federal government, are at each other's throats, essentially. And Washington is trying his best to keep the peace between not only Anti-Federalists and Federalists, but Southerners and Northerners, and big state Americans, small state Americans. And so Washington has this very monumental task in front of him. And to him, Masonry, I think, is very much an influence. And to pinpoint one example, the Jewish population in the United States at the time is small, but it exists. We would be remiss not to mention Haym Salomon, who is extremely important to Americans winning the American Revolution. So shortly after Washington becomes president, he will go to Rhode Island on a trip. This is sort of I really wouldn't call it a victory trip, because although someone does sort of run against him, Washington is clearly going to be the president. He goes on a tour of the United States, and he goes to Rhode Island, and he visits Toro Synagogue in Rhode Island, which at the time was the largest Jewish congregation in the United States. And he essentially tells them the United States will be a country which gives bigotry no sanction. That's the end of the quote. I don't know. I couldn't tell you the quote fully offhand, but essentially says the United States will be a tolerant nation. What most historians don't know, and that is a very, very quoted line by historians, that particular instance is talked about a lot by Washington and Revolution historians. That same trip, he goes to King David Lodge in Rhode Island, and essentially gives the same speech, but it's more Masonic than the one he gives to the one to Torah Synagogue. And for a sitting president who everyone is assuming is a Christian to go to a majority Jewish lodge and essentially affirm the principles of Freemasonry and what he wants the United States to be, and say, I understand we may have different religions, but I respect you as brothers and I respect you as Americans. That is huge.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here as you're talking about this, thinking of that as one of the issues, but the massive issues that surrounded, you think of challenges for the first president. I mean, besides how are we going to pay these war debts? How are we going to pay our soldiers? How are we going to establish a treasury? How are we going to have a capital? And then all of the other real, honestly, the domestic issues that affect us today when it comes to tolerance, equality, slavery, which was a problem then. And, we are still experiencing the after effects of that now, many generations later. This was all being torn in many directions. Like, it just really speaks to the amount of just the amazing leadership skills that he had, honestly. I'm curious. I've never been able to ask anybody this question, and I'm glad to have somewhat of a George Washington expert here. Was it known at the time that George Washington was, hey, he's brother George Washington, he's a Freemason?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Everywhere Washington went, the brothers showed out. They would come out, and it didn't matter if the Grand Master of whatever colony was there. Washington was more important. The largest Masonic gathering at the time, this was in Pennsylvania, I believe, happened when Washington visited, I believe it was Philadelphia. It was the largest Masonic gathering on record. It was only 200 people, but for the 1700s, that was huge. And they called him Venerable Brother Washington and invented all these honorifics we don't even have now, but he was the most important Mason in the room. And I think when Washington was commander-in-chief of the armed forces, that helped him sort of keep ties with people he was serving in the army with, and it helped the cohesiveness of the actual colonial army. A lot of the way Freemasonry came to the United States from Britain was through lodges formed in individual British regiments. And that continued for a very long time, especially in the British Army. But they emulated that in the colonial army for the colonial soldiers. And so you would have enlisted men who were joining Freemasonry. The Dr. Joseph Warren, the first sort of high-profile person to die in the American Revolution on Bunker Hill, was brother Dr. Joseph Warren. And so Freemasonry was pervasive, not only because everyone knew Washington, but because they were just all around in American colonial society. And Washington sort of gives it a lot more popularity. He becomes this figure, and everybody wants to be like Washington. If I can join Freemasonry, I can be more like Washington, and look how great Washington is. And Washington becomes so popular. I just want to illustrate this point. And Washington becomes so popular and makes Freemasonry so popular with him that at the end of his sort of military career, and when they're deciding what to call the president, they want to call the president Washington, like Caesar. So the current president would be Washington Biden, not President Biden.
I want to leave on a high note, but your lecture continues to go on to include the labor movement. We're not going to bring that into this discussion, but it is, when you talk about how one person could raise Freemasonry because they were a prominent Freemason and it was forever tied to them. It is kind of the sad, dark side of the Washington story as well, is that with Washington's decline, that's when Freemasonry began to decline in America. Give us a little snapshot of that. And I want you to leave enough on the table, because I want, you to give this lecture in other lodges. But for those that wouldn't be able to attend, what happened?
Well, Washington eventually does pass away to that celestial lodge in the sky, and it's sort of without a leader. There's no one to kind of pick up the mantle and be the quintessential American Freemason. And Washington sort of declines. there are rumblings of sort of not necessarily a labor uprising, but Thomas Jefferson gets elected president in 1800. He calls it the Revolution of 1800, and Jefferson believes in more of a people's democracy. He will start the Democratic Republicans, which in a very twisty way becomes the foundation of the Democratic Party, sorry, and then Andrew Jackson will continue that later on in the 19th century. But there's this sort of rebellion against this, what they would call the bloated upper class, this sort of landed gentry, this, and I where to use this word, but this bourgeoisie that exists in the United States. And so that starts to get looked at with suspicion. And a part of that, because at this point, Freemasonry is very much a rich old white man's club, becomes suspicious. It's kind of tied to this bourgeois sort of view of America, and that's by the 1800s what's starting to be rebelled against. And of course, and I'll leave it on a cliff note here, or a cliffhanger, there is a murder that takes place in upstate New York that really sets the die on anti-Masonry in the United States.
Big thanks to my guest this week for coming on, Brother Justin McCulloch from Colonial Lodge number 1821 here in Washington, D.C. If you're interested in having him speak or to talk more about this lecture, we're going to include his contact information in the notes for this podcast episode.
Please come down. We would love to have you all.
If you've enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more, you can tell Siri or Alexa to play the Craftsman Online podcast. We're available on all streaming platforms with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.